Let me start by thanking Penn State for, number one, the invitation, and secondly, for the foresight to put this event together. I think in the world of seminars, a room this size is a modest endeavor, but I'll be very surprised if this isn't the first of a great many events like this, not necessarily associated with Penn State, but in general, because I think this is a subject whose time is not only come, it's probably well overdue. This is something that I think, from my own perspective, we've been dealing with anecdotally for a very long period of time. And we're getting to the point where we can start to separate research, reality, and anecdote a bit, and can see a set of principles and some good science that gives us as an industry and other industries some direction, and with that some tools. So my role with the time I have with you today is really to provide as much objectivity as I can to the issue of what is culture as we understand it relative to our industry, and specifically as it relates to safety culture, and what is this this component called climate, and what's the difference, and what can we do with them. So I'm going to try to stick to the science as much as possible, and where I can't help it, and some opinion and maybe a little bias pops in, I'll try to identify that as something that I own for myself, based either on experience or just opinion. I think most of us have a pretty good understanding of what culture is. Like some descriptions, it's not something that I can describe as well as I can sense it, and I can get a feeling for it when I'm in it. And if you've been around at all, you know that there are great many different cultures, certainly organizational cultures, in our industry in particular. And there are different components to this. They can be horizontal, they can be vertical. So what exists in the corporate structure of a company in terms of culture may not reflect what's happening down in the business units, or it may, if you're fortunate. What happens in one business unit or even one mine not be consistent with other. That a lot of these cultures are local, and they're dependent on a great many variables that aren't always amenable to full control. So we kind of have to own that right up front. A lot of the opinion around culture, I think, in this industry and others, is this is difficult stuff to get your arms around. This is nebulous, it's soft, it's hard to really get a feel for. It's hard to do something with objectively. And at this level, probably so, but I think as we drill down a bit, we begin to understand that there's more focus at hand and more of an opportunity for us to understand it. So safety culture is a subset of overall organizational culture. And for me, there is a very important component associated with risk when we talk about safety being a subset of organizational culture. And that is the higher the risk profile, the more critical risk is to the survival and prosperity of an organization, the more critical that safety culture becomes. And in fact, it should be the single most important component. And in some organizations, the nuclear industry, for example, would be a good example. I think that's quite true. It's hard for us to imagine, in the US anyway, operating in that particular industry and not having safety, the concern both for your employees and the public, is being a really core aspect of your organizational culture. So what we have then, and well described previously, is culture basically is how we get things done around here, and there's two components to it. There's how I believe and how I think, and there's the behavior component. And this is collective. It's not just me individually. It is that I identify a certain way of thinking and a certain way of behaving that's consistent with a lot of other people in my organization, in my facility, in my corporation. So We're going to look at those two pockets this morning a little bit with a much stronger bias on what I think and believe, because much of the research today, and over the last 20 years or so, we now have hundreds of studies that have been published looking at how you characterize safety culture, how that relates to organizational culture in general, how I measure it, and whether there's a correlation between certain characteristics of safety culture and performance, particularly in the area of safety performance. So less on the behavioral side, because I think that's a little more difficult, oddly enough, because that's visible to measure. However, the rest of the program today is chock full of people who have really outstanding experience in the area of working with some of these tools from the standpoint of how we act and how we behave as an organization or as individuals. So Tony and John Gallick and even Kenny Murray from Alliance, these people are some of the most senior practitioners in the industry and bring a huge amount of perspective to the conversation today. I'm looking forward to what they have to say. Another characteristic here that's important is we use terminology a lot. We say, I have a safety culture, or our culture is about safety. Really, we're talking about whether or not we have elements in our culture that are oriented towards safety, certainly. But we reserve a culture of safety, a phrase for those organizations who are really at the apex in terms of both their performance and the characteristics of a strong and positive safety culture. And I won't mention any names. I think we can all think of an organization perhaps that's like that. But we need to be careful not to confuse those two. We need to, as an industry, we need to be careful to reserve the notion of having a culture of safety as organizations who are really at the highest level. And we don't know quite what that is. That's still pretty anecdotal. It's really about opinion. I think as our industry begins to do more in working with these as real tools, things that can be measured, things that can be managed, and that we can look long term to see what the correlation is between doing that work and performance outcomes. Over time, it's going to become clear that there are certain patterns and certain characteristics that are more typical of our industry than of others, and that we can reserve that apex title for those organizations who really do get to the top. And so here's a bit of bias. This is my definition of some of the key characteristics I see in the U.S., attention, not international, the U.S. mining industry. We're an industry that's pretty audacious. We go dig great big holes in the ground, or small holes very deep, pull out minerals and turn them into absolutely critical commodities that we need in the world. Because it's around us and because we see it all the time, we tend to take it for granted. It's a pretty amazing thing if you think about it. And it's not something that as an industry we trumpet a whole lot. In fact, it's probably one of our downfalls. People who work in this industry tend to be very independent. They tend to be self-reliant. And I mean at the individual and organizational level. Hardworking, I think family-oriented. Individualism, and I don't mean independence or self-reliance, as opposed to collectivism. So if we're looking at cultures, mining cultures outside the U.S., say particularly in Asia and Latin America, there tends to be a greater focus on the group, whereas in the U.S., we're all very independent. It's about us as individuals very often. And likely this issue of power distance, the relationship between the person who provides direction and manages and those who report to that individual. In this country, and I think in this industry, it tends to be relatively small, that distance, whereas in other cultures outside the U.S., again, to some extent Asia and Latin America, those distances tend to be much broader. By show of hands, anybody here strongly disagree with this characterization? Am I way off the map in terms of the way you see our industry? Last line there is probably an important one, and we can debate whether this is an accurate portrayal or not. I think it's critical that we do a fair amount of risk accommodation and rationalization. I think when you live with the kind of risks that we deal with in mining, there may be more of a tendency to be more comfortable with risk. And whether that's a good thing or not, if you have good control of your risk, it probably is. If you don't, it's probably a bad thing. But this is something that we need to be careful with, because the risk in mining, for me, is qualitatively different than it is in a lot of other industries. In the chemical industry, in the nuclear industry, you could argue that their risk profile in terms of potential harm to their own employees and to the communities in which they operate is quite high. Yeah? But every day the nuclear power plant guy comes to work, he knows where the nuclear reactor is going to be. He doesn't show up on Monday after leaving on Friday and the cooling tower is 60 meters to the left. Yep, which is what we deal with in mining. There is a dynamic aspect to risk in mining that's unique. There is a proximity issue related to risk in mining having to do with, until that day when it becomes fully autonomous, and I know many people hope that day doesn't come, you have to have proximity between the miner and the ore. And that's quite different. We don't generally put nuclear operators in the core building while things are fired up, not for very long periods of time. So those are some of the differentiators that I think are relevant and why the culture in our industry is a little bit different than it is in others. So again, this is a topic that we're really, I think, it's not as though we haven't had discussions about this. Obviously, anecdotally, we've been talking about this for a long time. But in having any kind of objective grasp and managing it as a part of our toolkit, we're relatively new at this, I think. Other industries, that may not be the case, and I think the first place that we really see reference to this safety culture as something that really needs to be looked at carefully in concert to performance came out of the OECD report on Chernobyl back in the mid-80s, 1986, 87. First reference to safety culture and why it was that the operators at that plant who were underway looking at an experiment, if you will, when that process went out of control, resulting in the disaster that we had. But there have been many other industries that have had, if not precipitating disasters that led to a wholesale evaluation of culture and what you can do with it, then slowly whittling away. The medical industry, for example, got tired, I think, of reading about problems in that industry, either in the pharmaceutical side or taking out the wrong leg. We've all heard about these stories and have gone and done a lot of work in characterizing culture, safety culture, characteristics of that, and what's the relationship between that and good patient care. So the takeaway is this is not new. Other industries have gone down this path, maybe not with absolute certainty, but with a reasonable amount of confidence, so that if we are in this business of trying to manage culture, trying to enhance culture as a way of improving performance, we are not without frame of reference. Now, you can argue all day about whether the medical experience is relevant to us as an industry, but we can argue that there is already a path that's been tread that allows us to compare our experience against something else. There is already some benchmark out there. And one of the other trends that I think is critical is that as an industry and against these other industries, we recognize that there is an essential obligation and importance to complying with regulation, but that even if we comply at a high level, that's not absolute assurance that we're going to get the performance we want to have in terms of outcomes. And this is true, I think, here in the U.S. as well as other countries. So there's been an evolution toward the use of management systems as a tool to more comprehensively manage safety and health in a lot of different industries. And I think we're going to see more of that in our own as well. A lot of multinational corporation mining companies today, particularly those that are domiciled outside the U.S., are already using management systems. And in fact, in places like Australia, there is no difference really between the regulation, which are risk-based management systems, and the way that mining companies manage. They're quite in concert, which I think is to the benefit of everybody. But systems are not a panacea. They are just a way of organizing tools and managing the business of mining that perhaps is a bit more efficient and more effective. But it doesn't mean that they work automatically. And examples of why we need to be paying more attention to the nexus of systems and culture, I think, can be illustrated in a couple of examples here. For some of you who are old enough, it's like most of us might have been, probably remember where you were in 1986, that fateful day when we had a disaster in Cape Canaveral involving the failure of an O-ring on a solid rocket booster, ironically built in my new home state of Utah, that resulted in the world watching the astronauts be killed on takeoff. It was really a national tragedy, one that put the mission of NASA, you might argue an organization with a different risk profile, but nonetheless one this entire mission is based on managing risk, and one in terms of their characteristics who have world-class systems. You can't build and fly rockets and go to the moon unless you know all about good management systems. So the Challenger investigation that followed that incident came back with some, at the time, surprising observations. I think most people thought there was going to be an issue around the quality of engineering of those O-rings, the technical aspects of that system. And they in fact said, look, they had good standards, but in the process of launching these things periodically, it got to the point where they noticed they could go beyond what was the design specification for those, the limits of their performance. They were able to go past it until that fateful day in '86 where it was cold enough that it caused them to actually fail. It wasn't really the physical design of the O-rings that was at issue, the root cause. It was a failure in the management system, that the leadership at NASA was so focused on seeing that program as a bus to outer space and having the teacher on board at the time and the entire world watching, that they didn't really listen to those people who were lower in the organization who said, from a risk perspective, you can't do this. This is beyond the design capability. And the result, of course, was this catastrophic loss. So what happened? Well, NASA said to Congress and everyone else, we're going to learn everything we can from this. We are going to incorporate these learnings, and we are never going to repeat this again. And of course, they spent billions of dollars, they retooled the shuttle, and they began to fly again. And we as a nation smiled and looked at it with pride. And then perhaps you remember where you were in 2003 when the Columbia broke up over Texas, killing another crew. And you think to yourself, well, that space, there is a risk associated with it. But if you peel the layers of the onion away, you begin to see a parallel issue between this set of circumstances and those from Challenger, which was a piece of foam broke off the major rockets. It hit the wing of the shuttle. It caused a hole, which they couldn't see. NASA management at the time said, from a risk perspective, we don't think there's anything wrong. And oh, by the way, our alternative is we're going to drop you guys on the International Space Station, let the shuttle burn up, and have to ask the Russians to fly up and get you and come back down. So backhaul conversation, which wasn't really made public necessarily up front, was that's probably not good. It may have been more of a cost-benefit analysis than it was a risk assessment. Did they again listen to the people in the bowels of NASA who said, we're not certain that this thing is going to be airworthy coming in, and in fact it clearly wasn't. So another major investigation, and the conclusion was NASA organizational culture had as much to do with this as any design issue associated with flying the shuttle. So what's the lesson for us as an industry? We don't fly spaceships, right? What do you think? Well, I think there's two issues here. One of them is, if you're interested in safety excellence, define it any way you want. If you're not paying attention to your culture, you're blind to a major influencer on terms of how well your systems work and what kind of performance you're going to get. That's number one. Number two, this is one of the most sophisticated, well-resourced, well-managed organizations in the world, in my opinion. And despite all of the public pressure to get this right, two spectacular failures. So let's not be naive and assume that all we need to do is come over here and turn a couple of dials and we get the result and change we want when it comes to culture. We're not that far along. So we have a new opportunity and I think an obligation to spend a lot more time trying to deal with these issues, but it's not the same as putting in a good lockout tagout program or make sure we're really focused on proximity detection. It doesn't lend itself to that degree of control. Second incident that brings this home, I think, most of us are aware of what happened with British Petroleum, Texas City Refinery in 2005. It was a process safety related issue. Very good performance in terms of personal safety, but there was a disconnect between the risk that really existed at that refinery and other refineries and what the corporate managers thought was going on in the business. They were focused on whether they had a lot of recordable injuries, but the risk was whether or not the place was going to blow up, and it did. And it killed a lot of people. From a shareholder standpoint, it scrubbed about $1.5 billion in value. They went away and they investigated it, and the result from Jim Baker's commission was, if you don't have a healthy culture in all of this, doesn't matter how good your systems are, you're going to be struggling. Once again, got their act together, went back to work after they got beat up pretty heavily, and I think most of us know what happened last year in the Gulf of Mexico. Same corporation, same culture, different division. Well, but again, this brings home this issue of the continuity in culture between the top of the organization and what happens in the business units. A spectacular failure, if you had a look at this, the commission who looked into that one subsequently got back down to the same conclusion. It was a failure in the culture that contributed pretty heavily to a failure of systems that resulted in the spill and the fire, or vice versa. So for me, it comes down to this relationship. For a long time, we've been worried about and very myopically focused on trying to improve our systems, be that compliance with MSHA, which is totally appropriate, or OSHA, or actual management systems. And now we're realizing that not only do we have to do that well, but we really need to be focused on this issue of culture. But you really cannot do that effectively unless you have a good understanding and control of leadership in your organization. And so I'll take exception to Mr. Fullen's observation around the influence of senior management and leadership in the educational environment, because I think without that, you are never going to get sustained culture change. It's not only about senior management, but without it, to be able to lead and drive the change necessary to have the kind of sustainable culture you want to have, it's not going to work.
I'm sorry, he would have agreed with what you just said.
Okay, good. So I hope I didn't misread it. No. Right. So this suddenly is very different than what I signed up for when I first got into industry. It was lockout and tagout and training, and it was inspections, and it was machine guarding. And today I think we have a much broader view, and it's a little bit scary because it's topics that maybe are harder for us to relate to if you're a dyed-in-the-wool HSE professional. It suggests that we're going to have to maybe wear some different hats. It starts to feel a lot more like social science and social engineering in a non-cynical way. And maybe it is, quite frankly. So one of the other terms we want to make sure we get some clarification on is the issue of climate. A term that's used to describe our ability to measure culture in any kind of objective way. And we can't really do that, but what we can do is we can look at an organization cross-sectionally and get an understanding of what people in that organization perceive to be the culture or important in that culture. And that's climate. So no matter what the culture is, the way that you're able to measure it with some degree of objectivity and continuity is to look at climate. Ask employees what they think of the organization. And in order to make sure that that is done in a way that they will tell you what they're really thinking, it's very often advisable that you do that confidentially. So when we hear culture and climate, culture is the very broad term we use to understand both what we think, how we think, and way we behave as a collective group in an organization related to overall culture or safety. And the climate is your ability to measure that cross-sectionally, one point in time. And just like there are differences vertically and horizontally in an organization and culture, likewise, using these kind of instruments, you're not going to be measuring everything at once, and that's the way it's going to be for 10 years. But it is our way of understanding what's there. And I'm very interested in hearing the NIOSH presentation this afternoon because I think they're bringing some very important perspective to this. This is part of my practice in doing this kind of work. It inevitably leads to some very, very interesting outcomes. Are you familiar with the term cognitive dissonance? This is where I think I'm Superman until I look in the mirror and I realize I'm about as far from that as you can possibly be. And it happens also with organizations. When senior management says, I know what my culture is, I know what my people think. And inevitably, going through this kind of process, you're going to get some cognitive dissonance. There's going to be a disconnect. Sometimes it's minor, sometimes it's major. And I don't think that's a bad thing. It's about understanding our companies better. So what then are some of these attributes and characteristics? There's been a lot of work done to understand this. And typically how it worked is researchers went into the field, they took high-performing companies in terms of safety, and they said, what are the characteristics, the attributes that these companies tend to display on a continuous basis? And is there any commonality between these different organizations? And so this is not intended to be any kind of absolute comprehensive list. It is, this slide and the next one capture what come up time and time again as many of the most common, but it's certainly not meant to be comprehensive. And we don't really have time to go through this in detail, but I'll pull out one or two of these, and I think it should be blatantly obvious that in any organization where there isn't some degree or a healthy degree of trust between the people who manage and those people who do the work, culturally you're going to have problems. Adherence to systems, belief in we can do much better than we're doing now, and we need to emphasize behavior more. You're going to have trouble if you don't have trust. Yeah, that should be pretty obvious. Things like justice, report, and learning. In very high-performing organizations, they are just organizations in a sense that their use of discipline and the consequences associated with rules and policy violations is fair and equitable. Employees understand what the ground rules are, and when a violation or error of that occurs, it's not a pure black or white situation. They say, we're going to make a judgment about what's fair and reasonable here. And as a result of that, that builds trust. And as a result of the trust in those organizations, when an incident happens, they're more likely to be reported because they're not as concerned about negative consequences. And in fact, the better your performance gets, the more important this becomes, because I think we all understand today that incidents are really an indication of what's gone wrong in our management system. And if our incident rate is already low, how are you going to know what you need to do to get better? because you have few of those errors out there. Well, something like near-miss reporting becomes very critical. To me, it's one of the earmarks of strong cultures, that if you have very open and transparent reporting of that, because there is trust, it's a good thing for a company to have a reasonably high number of those things reported. Not to continually have that way. You want to be able to manage them out eventually. And once you get that reporting, if you're able to learn from that, understand what root cause is, and then apply those learnings to prevent recurrence, you're going a long way to being very good in safety management, along with everything else that you have to do. But look for companies, no matter how big or small, what their commodity is, what their mining technique is, and ask those basic questions. Do you have trust? Is it a just organization in terms of discipline and violation? Do people report things openly, and we don't have to prime that by motivating them monetarily or putting a quota on it, and that they understand the value of reporting that kind of information and then subsequently learn from it. And oh, by the way, if I involve my workers in the analysis of those incidents, put them in a position of empowerment to understand what went wrong with our company, and then help management make changes to improve it, that's probably bringing some other issues up relative to culture that are very important. Deference to experience, an ugly lesson that NASA has learned over time. Listen to the young or even experienced engineers in the bowel of the building if they say don't do that. It's very important. Being mindful, being aware of hazard and risk, and being sensitive to that at all times. Being wary so that even when performance is good, there's a lot of hand-wringing. Management is apprehensive that it's so quiet. It's been 5 years since anything's happened. Instead of saying, that's something we're good at, let's move on to quality, I can take my eye off it for a while, because organizationally we're competent. Get ready to get surprised. Those world-class performing organizations tend to dislike that silence. It makes them nervous. They're constantly asking, what's going on? What's behind the silence? And then accountability for me, which is probably the single best indicator of high-performing organizations in terms of those who understand the importance of not discipline per se, but the ability to use positive and negative consequences around responsibilities for safety. And another very measurable issue. So this isn't by any means comprehensive, but if you were looking for these characteristics in your own organizations and had an understanding of how they were weighted, you'd be a long way to understanding key issues associated with good safety culture. There is a special type of organization, nuclear power plants, aircraft carriers, where organizations have been able to operate at a very high level, very long periods of time in very high risk profile environments with almost no losses. How are they able to do that? And again, research suggests that a lot of the characteristics and attributes we just were talking about tend to be very common in these organizations. And so when you hear HRO, you'll know that this is reserved for a special group of companies that we would all be wise to pay attention to. I think this leads really to a couple of critical questions. Those high, reliable organizations, did they get that way because they already had those characteristics in their organizations, or did those characteristics show up because they were good in safety? Chicken or egg argument, right? And why is that important for us? Who cares, other than an academic conversation?
You're going to manage change.
Mr. Gallick says you're going to manage change. It leads to the most important question we have, which is, can a company enhance these characteristics that will then facilitate improvement in performance along with the other things you're doing? If those characteristics show up as a result of good performance, it's a little muddier picture. If I can improve those things simultaneously to the other things I'm doing in safety and get a synergistic bounce from that, then that's really exciting news. The jury is not absolutely out on this. We're not 100% certain, but anecdotally and certainly in terms of the overall trend in the research, the answer is yes, you can. So the term I like to use is strategic cultural management, kind of big nasty phrase, and it means we should and can measure ourselves against some of these characteristics and put in place interventions that allow us to get better. So this is part research and part bias. This is my approach to how this can get done. It's very generic, and we'll move very quickly through this. But you need to start with phase one, which is what are the cultural characteristics that are important to you? The fact that I say that those characteristics show up in a lot of companies across a lot of industries that are world-class or excellent and consistently so doesn't mean that those are the things that you're necessarily going to hone in on. But it behooves any of us doing this kind of work that we need to get educated. It's not just anything. It's not just that you feel like if I had a culture that, you know, was sympathetic to hanging pink pigs from their feet in my mind, I'm going to get a really good performance. We have to look to see what the research tells us and what anecdotal evidence tells us really works. So there are a great many models out there available to us, again, from different industries. The nuclear industry, there are some commercial products available. DuPont has them. I'm very interested to see where NIOSH is going on that because I think that's an exciting opportunity for us as an industry. The offshore people, the nuclear, there's been a lot of work done in the mining industry in Australia on this. In fact, they're probably 10 years ahead in terms of doing the diagnostics and understanding the correlation. So we're not for lack of benchmark. We can go there and say which of these models, which of these characteristics we think fits best. And then there's kind of a dual side to that question. It is, what do I think my culture is now? And how does my culture line up against these other characteristics that are important in terms of driving performance improvement? So I like probably to know both of those things, because if I think I've got the right culture and I'm measuring things that don't work, that'll not be good. And the second part of this is to actually measure it. And we do this through confidential perception surveys. And this, again, is work that's been done for a number of years. So the process is well known, even if there's a lot of variability to it. As you can see on the left, there's a lot of questions that you need to ask and answer in order to get the design right for your organization. One size does not fit all. You can also use observations to determine whether or not your culture is consistent, whether people are living up to the policies and procedures, whether you're seeing behaviors that are consistent in those kind of organizations. And then follow-up interviews, which is something I generally would do to make sure that we get the context, the why behind the what from the data that you get out of these perception surveys. Things like, is it truly confidential? Is it represent a majority of the workforce? If you do these things, you can get some pretty interesting information. This is generally how I like to look at it, the kind of data I provide for clients, which is spiderweb type of graph that allow them to understand where they are at any one point in time relative to some of these attributes, and then over time you remeasure using the same tool, and it tells you how well you're doing. You obviously want to fill the whole spiderweb up eventually, and that's a good thing. And then comes the the wide open piece to this. So now I've understood what characteristics I'm concerned with. I've gone out and measured it. I have a pretty good understanding of that. There's maybe even some statistical significance in it. Now what do I do? Well, how do you improve when it comes to justice? How do you improve accountability? How do you improve trust? And this is obviously well beyond the limits of this brief conversation this morning, but I hope that's part of what's going to be talked about the rest of the day and in the hallways and afterwards, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. Do we have tools available to us that allow us to improve these things in our organizations? If you want to take it a step further, this change isn't going to happen without leadership. So having a leadership development process that can facilitate the culture change becomes credible and important. Knowing what competencies will help drive that kind of change becomes issue. And there's a parallel conversation then between culture and leadership. Organizational competencies, characteristics of culture, and leadership competencies, and those things are directly related. And then lastly, if you want to make sure that this is not just a cross-sectional exercise that gets left behind when additional change comes, you have to be able to integrate this stuff into your performance management and succession planning in the end. So let me finish up here. The research is also clear that no matter how motivated your senior management team is, that they suddenly want to be world-class in terms of culture, you can't buy your way to this. You cannot will your way to it faster than your organization will change. And there are some fairly characteristic milestones in that change that occur that say you can enter this graph in different places, but you're probably going to have to go through some of these steps, and it may take a period of time. Think many months or years, not weeks and months. And model for me looks a bit like this. Having leaders with the right personal ethics, having a leadership style that drives the kind of change that we need to have, and anybody who hasn't looked at transformational leadership would do well to focus on that. Having a set of leadership practices or competencies that will drive the change you need in the culture may seem like a lot of nebulous social engineering, but there's very clear evidence now that not only can you do it, whether you're a big company or small, it works. And if you're really devoted to having safety excellence, the closer you get to zero, the more critical these things are going to become. You cannot avoid them. So I'll finish up with this. How many people in here are safety and health professionals? Show of hands. Okay. How many are associated with government or academia, and how many people are associated with labor? Okay. Thank you for being here. No matter what your orientation is, when I got into this as a safety health professional, this wasn't what I studied. This wasn't what I understood. These are social sciences. Is this really the sandbox I want to be playing in? If we're sitting here, and by the way, how many CEOs, COOs, or business unit presidents do we have here? Thank you for being here. This is not change that happens because the safety manager realizes its importance. This has to be recognized in the highest levels. They need to lead and resource and drive this change. So if we're learning about it, how do we affect change? Who delivers the message? How do we get this to resonate with senior management? And I think that's hopefully something you're all going to talk about here today as well. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, and looking forward to the rest of the day.